Welcome guys, tonight we'll be drifting slowly into the dim and distant world of the Middle Ages, where love was rarely romantic, and dating, as we understand it today, was a near impossibility. In this long, quiet journey, you'll discover why finding love in medieval times was more a nightmare than a dream. So now, dim your lights, lie back gently, and let your thoughts soften. Close your eyes, and allow the slow weight of history to lull you into sleep. In the still, breathless quiet of medieval Europe, love did not wander freely through fields of possibility, nor did it flourish under the warmth of mutual affection. It did not take shape in whispered conversations beneath the stars, nor did it bloom in the spontaneous glances of young hearts drawn together by fate. Instead, love, or rather the institution in which it was expected to exist, was crafted coldly at long oak tables, under the steady gaze of stewards, scribes, and patriarchs, whose hands inked not letters of passion but contracts of alliance. Marriage, in the medieval world, was a matter of survival, stability, and strategy. The idea of dating, in the modern sense of discovering compatibility, was as foreign to the age as glass windows in a peasant's hut. Throughout the centuries between the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the early modern state, marriage functioned not as a personal bond but as a formal mechanism for the transfer of property, power, and social order. In noble families, the stakes were even higher. Marriage was a tool of dynastic maneuvering, and each union was a piece moved with deliberate calculation across the treacherous board of feudal politics. Children were promised before they could speak, and young girls, scarcely old enough to understand the fullness of their own lives, were pledged to men they would never choose for themselves. The motivations were almost never emotional. They were legal, economic, and often territorial. For the nobility, the marriage of a son or daughter could mean the acquisition of new lands, the strengthening of claims, or the forging of peace between long feuding houses. The union of two individuals, then, was not an event unto itself, but a thread woven into the vast fabric of political arrangement. There were no dates, no long walks, no courtships in private gardens. Instead, there were negotiations, sometimes taking years, between fathers and uncles and lords. Contracts were drawn up detailing dowries, inheritances, and rights to lineage. The young people at the heart of the arrangement were incidental. Their emotions were not consulted. Their preferences were rarely considered. In the countryside, among the peasantry, things were no less structured, though the motivations were more practical than political. In a world governed by survival, marriage was less a union of hearts than a merger of labor forces. A man might seek a wife who could bear children to help on the land, tend livestock, and carry water. A woman might seek the relative security of a husband with a plot of land, a thatched roof, and a sturdy pair of hands. While these marriages lacked the cold politics of the noble class, they shared the same fundamental absence of choice. Even among villagers, unions were subject to approval by family elders, and shaped by the rhythms of inheritance, tenancy, and obligation. Among both nobles and peasants, love was viewed with suspicion. Romantic affection, if it emerged, was seen as a destabilizing force, a distraction from duty. The Church, ever watchful, encouraged unions based on Christian order and discipline, rather than carnal attachment. Marriage was a sacrament, a spiritual bond ordained by God, and its sanctity was best preserved when passion was kept at bay. For those who did fall in love, dangerously, inconveniently, the consequences could be severe. A nobleman who loved beneath his station could trigger a scandal. A maiden who formed a secret bond risked dishonor, shame, or worse. Even in the rare moments where affection found a small corner to grow, it was expected to do so after the marriage, not before it. Love, in the medieval worldview, was not a prerequisite to marriage, but a potential byproduct. It was hoped, though not required, that affection might blossom in time between husband and wife. But it was not essential. What mattered was that the structure of society was preserved, that alliances were honored, and that heirs were produced. The emotional texture of the marriage was largely irrelevant to its perceived success. The Church codified these principles through canon law, defining what constituted a legitimate marriage and forbidding unions that did not meet its strict criteria. Bans on consanguinity, marrying close relatives, were enforced not out of concern for romantic confusion, but to ensure the legal purity of bloodlines. Marriages made in secret or without parental consent were frowned upon, and many such unions were nullified or penalized. The idea that two people could marry simply because they wished to be together was an unsettling notion in a world that prized order over emotion. Thus, in the medieval imagination, courtship did not resemble anything like a modern relationship. There were no casual meetings in marketplaces followed by hesitant flirtations. No thoughtful pauses in conversation while one weighed the possibilities of a shared future. No long seasons of mutual discovery. Instead, there was structure, expectation, and a slow, methodical march toward union. Marriage was inevitable, and its design was shaped by forces far beyond the reach of the people it bound. This rigid framework did not change quickly. Across centuries, the ideals of romantic love would flicker at the edges of medieval literature and poetry, but those idealized visions remained largely divorced from the lived experience of marriage itself. In stories, love might be celebrated. In life, it was controlled. The nightmare of dating, in medieval times, lay in the simple fact that it did not exist. There was no courtship of choice, only arrangements of necessity. And so, for generation after generation, young people were raised to understand that marriage was not theirs to seek, but theirs to accept. It was not a path they walked freely, but one paved for them by others, long before they reached the age of choosing. In that world, love was not a freedom. It was at best a tolerated accident. In the long shadows cast by castles and cottages alike, the question of a man's worth in medieval society was measured not by the depth of his affection, nor the softness of his words, but by the land he held beneath his feet, the name he carried in his blood, and the permissions granted to him by men of higher station. In a time when the earth itself was considered a ledger of loyalty and inheritance, a man seeking to marry, whether noble or common, did not first ask the question of love, but rather the question of whether he had the right. Feudal Europe was not governed by freedom, but by chains of obligation. Every man owed something to someone above him. A peasant served a reeve, who served a lord, who served a baron, who served a king, who in turn was believed to serve God. This great pyramid of allegiance shaped every facet of life, and marriage was no exception. For a man to marry, he needed not only the willingness of a woman's family, but often the explicit permission of his liege lord, bishop, or, in the case of guildsmen and townsfolk, sometimes even a local council. It was not merely a private union, but a legally binding rearrangement of status, property, and labor. Among the nobility, these permissions were intricately tied to inheritance. A man with no lands of his own was rarely considered suitable for marriage unless he was the heir to a sizable estate, or stood to inherit by proximity. Property, whether a manor, a flock, or even a small parcel of arable land, was the anchor of worth. A landless knight might offer his sword, but unless his loyalty translated into fiefdom, he would remain unsuitable for union. Suitors were assessed less on their character and more on their assets. A man who could not support a household, who could not pass on lands to children, who could not secure a dowry, was not truly a man in the eyes of feudal society. He was, in essence, a dependent, still tethered to the household of his father, or his lord. For commoners, the restrictions were different in form but not in essence. A villein, a tenant peasant bound to the land, could not legally marry without permission from the lord of the manor. The reasoning was simple. A marriage might result in a labourer moving to another estate, disrupting the delicate balance of available workers. Lords wanted to protect their interests, not only in crops, but in people. The permission to marry was sometimes accompanied by a fine or fee known as a merchet, a grim reminder that even love was taxed. In some manorial roles, young men are listed with cold notations beside their names: paid for license to marry, fined for marrying without leave, or moved to wife's manor without consent. Thus, for men across all stations, the ability to marry was not an innate right, but a privilege to be granted. A man had to prove his ability to provide, to protect, to produce, and only then perhaps could he be permitted to marry. Social status functioned as an invisible but immovable wall, segregating classes and codifying eligibility. A knight's son did not marry a shepherd's daughter. A blacksmith's apprentice could not dream of courting the daughter of a guild master. Every union was scrutinized through the lens of hierarchy, and stepping beyond one's rank could invite ridicule, punishment, or annulment. Even in towns, where the slow erosion of feudalism gave way to a mercantile class, permission remained a powerful gatekeeper. A merchant wishing to marry might need the approval of his guild, particularly if the union could affect business relations or inheritance of shares. A man without apprenticeship, without trade, without backing, he was considered unfit to marry. Not because he lacked feeling, but because he lacked value in the transactional language of the age. What made this more complex was that manhood itself was not measured merely by age or experience, but by property and position. A 20-year-old with inherited land was considered a man. A 30-year-old servant, still dependent, was not. The right to choose a wife was not guaranteed by biology, but by economics. Masculinity was bound tightly to ownership. Even sexuality, in its permitted forms, was entangled with legal standing. A man who fathered a child outside of wedlock might be fined or excommunicated, but more importantly, he would often lack the legal ability to legitimize the union unless he could satisfy the social requirements for marriage. There existed, too, a quiet desperation among landless men, especially younger sons in noble families. Primogeniture, the legal principle that the firstborn son inherited everything, condemned many younger brothers to a life of dependence. These men, often trained for the church or for battle, were denied the opportunity to marry simply because they had nothing to offer. In time, many of these younger sons became knights errant, monks, or soldiers of fortune, wandering the margins of society, where romantic attachment was not only improbable, but perilous. One must also consider the heavy influence of ecclesiastical law which often reinforced these worldly hierarchies. The church might celebrate the sacrament of marriage, but it rarely challenged the secular permissions that preceded it. A priest might bless the union, but not without the appropriate documentation, proof of land, consent of family, absence of consanguinity, and sometimes even letters from lords or guardians. The concept of romantic love, spontaneous and passionate, crashing through barriers of class and wealth, that was for troubadours and poets, not for real life. In this way, the idea of dating, of freely choosing whom one loved and whether one could wed, was dismantled by the sheer weight of medieval structure. A man might dream, perhaps, but the path to union was lined with paperwork, permissions and property deeds. Each step had to be sanctioned by layers of authority. The pressure to rise in status or preserve it meant that even genuine affection was often suppressed in favor of more suitable arrangements. Thus, a man's worth was not in his heart, but in his holdings, not in his devotion, but in his dowry. Marriage, that deeply personal act, became another obligation negotiated between social levels, and for those unable to meet these expectations, the poor, the second-born, the tenant, the vassal, marriage was not a door they could open, but a gate tightly locked by others, its keys hidden behind layers of class, wealth, and permission. In the quiet and dust-choked corners of medieval households, behind low wooden doors and stone-cold hearths, the life of a girl was shaped long before she had the strength to shape it herself. From the moment she took her first breath, swaddled in rough wool, and whispered into the records of the family, her future was not a blank slate, not an open path, but a narrow corridor, lined with decisions made by others. Her name might have been hers, but her fate belonged to those who raised her, her father, her brothers, her lord, her church. And at the center of that fate, from the earliest days of her existence, stood the institution of marriage, not as a romantic dream, but as a contract in waiting. Betrothal, that early arrangement so common in medieval life, often arrived when the girl was no more than a child. In noble families, where marriages served dynastic purposes, girls as young as 6 or 7 were promised to boys they had never met, whose families lived in distant shires or across foreign seas. The announcement of such a match was made with the same formality as a property deal, sealed by handshakes, blessings, and sometimes even written agreements on parchment. These betrothals were binding in both spirit and law, and breaking them could incur fines, excommunication, or long-lasting feuds. For the girl, the promise did not feel like a beginning. It felt more like a surrender, a slow, inevitable yielding to a life that had been decided for her. She would grow, yes, but always toward that day when the vows would be spoken, not from love, but from duty. Her body was not her own. It was a future dowry, a vessel for heirs, a line on a ledger that would someday merge two households into one. From the moment she could walk, she was groomed for obedience, taught to sew, to serve, to kneel, to accept. Education, where it existed for girls, was rarely for the cultivation of thought. It was for the maintenance of reputation. A noble girl might be taught to read religious texts or memorize the Psalms, but she would rarely be introduced to philosophy, law, or letters. Her skills were ornamental and practical: needlework, household management, etiquette, and silence. In peasant homes, the education was even more grounded in labor, learning to churn butter, bake bread, tend to infants, and patch worn clothing. All of it pointed toward one goal: becoming a wife in a household that had already been chosen for her. Once betrothed, the girl's life narrowed further. Her movements might be restricted, her interactions monitored. She would often be kept at home, away from village gatherings or marketplaces, lest her reputation be tarnished before marriage. Virginity, that fragile currency of her future value, was guarded with the intensity of a family heirloom. A misstep, even a rumor, could ruin not only her own standing, but her family's. There were no second chances. A girl labeled impure, even falsely, might find herself unwed, disgraced, or forced into a convent, where she would live not as a nun by calling, but as a woman cast aside. The marriage itself, when it came, was rarely grand for most. While nobles held feasts and processions, the deeper meaning remained unchanged. This was a transaction. The girl, now a woman in the eyes of the law, sometimes no older than 12 or 14, was handed from one authority to another. First a daughter under her father's rule, now a wife under her husband's. The church might bless the union as sacred, but it did not question the silence of the bride. Her consent was assumed, her future mapped. Obedience was the cornerstone of her new role. She was expected to serve her husband, bear his children, maintain his household, and never question his decisions. Even her personal thoughts, feelings, and desires were meant to be subordinate. In legal terms, she was considered femme covert, a covered woman, whose identity was absorbed into that of her husband. She could not own property independently, she could not make contracts, appear in court alone, or act as a legal person in many jurisdictions. She had become invisible to the machinery of the law, except through her husband's voice. In some rare cases, women in merchant towns or widows in possession of estates did gain a measure of autonomy, running businesses or managing land, but these were exceptions that proved the rule for the vast majority. Marriage was not a partnership, but a hierarchy. A woman who defied her husband could be beaten, legally and socially. A woman who failed to bear children might be cast aside. Love, if it existed, was tolerated only within these strict boundaries. A wife could not complain if she was unloved, nor escape if she was mistreated. Her fate had been sealed long ago, when her future was drawn up as ink on parchment during her earliest years. This lack of agency extended beyond life and into legend. Stories of noble women who fell in love outside of marriage often ended in tragedy or death. A maiden who eloped with a knight was rarely celebrated. She was punished. A queen who loved a courtier faced scandal and execution. The message was clear and consistent. A woman's love belonged to her husband, and if it strayed elsewhere, it ceased to be love at all. It became a sin, a crime, a disorder. Thus, from the soft hands of girlhood to the hardened tasks of womanhood, a medieval woman moved through a life that was largely not her own. She was passed between men like land, counted among assets, valued for her ability to carry forward bloodlines, cook meals, and serve in silence. There was little room for dreams, little space for desire, and even less for rebellion. In all of this, what remained absent was the possibility of dating. The freedom to meet, to choose, to wonder. That was a luxury no girl of the Middle Ages could count upon. For her the world of love was an invisible one, a world others spoke of in poems and tales, but one she rarely touched. Her heart, like her life, belonged first to her father, then to her husband, and never to herself. In the long subdued centuries of medieval life, where time itself seemed to drift like mist through stone courtyards and fields of barley, one truth remained nearly unshaken across both castle and cottage, that the authority of the father was paramount. Whether noble or common, wealthy or poor, a child's fate in matters of marriage was almost never guided by affection or personal longing. Instead, it was arranged by the steady hand of paternal oversight. As cold and precise as a tally in a ledger, marriage was not a union of hearts. It was a transaction, a quiet, calculated exchange of lineage, labor, and legacy. From the earliest years of a child's life, fathers, and in noble houses, sometimes even the extended family council, considered marriage not as a future event for the child to navigate, but as a strategic movement to be deployed for the benefit of the household. A daughter was a potential alliance, a son was a potential claimant, and these were not just possibilities, but assets to be deployed. The emotional maturity of the child, their feelings, their dreams, these mattered less than the practical benefit their union might secure. In this way, most marriages were not formed in youthful meetings under moonlight, but in careful conversations between men, fathers, uncles, lords, stewards. These discussions took place in halls, chambers, and cloisters, surrounded by documents, conditions, and obligations. Each detail was measured: the size of a dowry, the promise of inheritance, the proximity of estates, the political alignment of extended kin. A successful match required that the family's interests align, not the temperaments of the bride and groom. Fathers wielded immense legal and social power over the marital futures of their children. Among the nobility, this control was formalized. Canon law recognized the requirement of consent for marriage, but in practice, a father's disapproval could prevent a union entirely, even when the bride and groom were of age. A lord, likewise, could forbid a vassal's marriage if it interfered with feudal obligations or estate management. In these instances, a child's desire to marry someone outside of family plans was not simply discouraged, it could be punished, annulled, or erased from the record. This authority extended to women most starkly. A daughter's marriage was considered a father's solemn responsibility, not unlike the stewardship of livestock, land, or coin. She represented both a financial liability and an opportunity. Her dowry, sometimes livestock, sometimes property, sometimes coin, was negotiated not as a gift, but as a condition. It could bankrupt a poor family. It could fortify a wealthy one. Her future husband was not a man she would discover through conversation or companionship, but one chosen after long deliberation and strategic thought. Her heart had little to offer compared to the arithmetic of her value. Among peasants, the dynamic shifted slightly in scale but not in substance. A yeoman father might trade his daughter's hand to secure an extra field, a shared plough, or labor during harvest season. In towns, artisans arranged marriages that merged shops, tools, and apprenticeships. Even when sons sought brides, the parents were involved, assessing the usefulness of the union, calculating what the family gained or lost. If the match brought shame, the family's standing could suffer for generations. Honor was not a feeling, it was a fragile asset to be guarded at all costs. Court records and letters of the period reveal these dynamics with stark clarity. In countless wills, fathers outlined marital plans for daughters not yet of age. Contracts drafted between families include detailed clauses about behavior, chastity, inheritance, and often, financial penalties should one party withdraw. These were not the documents of romance. They were the language of trade, commitment, and legal precaution. Even among royalty, or especially among royalty, parental control reached near absolute power. Kings and queens negotiated marriages of their children, not just within realms but across continents, shaping political treaties through bloodlines. A daughter might be betrothed at the age of 5 to a prince she would not meet for a decade. If she objected as a teenager, there was no recourse. Her value lay in her compliance. Her body in effect became a diplomatic parcel. A royal wedding was rarely a celebration of love. It was a pageant of statecraft. In all these arrangements, affection was considered a fortunate accident, not a goal. If a couple grew to respect or even love one another, it was seen as a bonus, a reward for obedience and duty. But to expect love before marriage, that was regarded with skepticism, even fear. Love could be irrational, it could upset plans, it could lead to matches across class lines or worse, secret unions. To love without approval was to risk exile, disinheritance, or imprisonment. This was not a world that courted rebellion. It preserved order through predictability. A child who defied a father's marriage plan could be punished not only legally but spiritually. The church taught obedience to parents as a holy commandment. A son who married without blessing might be denied his family's land. A daughter might be cast out, labeled impure or shameful, forced into a nunnery, or worse. The price of independence was steep. The rewards of submission, though cold, were security, structure, and acceptance. Occasionally, stories of resistance surfaced. Lovers who eloped, who escaped to distant towns, who found sympathetic priests to wed them in secret. But these were exceptions, and their tales often ended in ruin. The overwhelming norm was compliance. Children, especially daughters, lived not as authors of their own love stories, but as signatures at the bottom of documents they did not write. And so, in this world, dating was not only impractical, it was virtually impossible. A boy and girl might see one another at mass, or in passing through a market square, but the idea that they could meet, talk, and build a bond that led to marriage without family intervention was almost unthinkable. Their hands might long to touch, but their futures were already being penned by older hands elsewhere. To be a child in the medieval world was to grow beneath the shadow of expectation. To be the daughter of a father was to be his responsibility and his bargaining piece. And to imagine love outside of these walls was for most to imagine a world that did not exist. In the dim silence of medieval sanctuaries, beneath vaulted stone ceilings and flickering candlelight, the church stood not only as the gatekeeper of souls, but also as the quiet architect of everyday life. From the public square to the most private chambers, its influence was ever present, patient, powerful, and deeply embedded. Among its many spheres of control, none was more intimate than that of human love, marriage, and desire. In a world where secular courts might punish a thief or a murderer, it was the Catholic Church that governed the heart and the body, with laws written not only in scripture, but in doctrine, dogma, and fear. The Church's control over romantic and sexual life was gradual, but comprehensive. From the early medieval period onward, it positioned itself as the final arbiter of legitimate unions, setting forth who could marry, when, and how. Marriage was transformed under its authority, from a social arrangement or economic contract into a sacrament, a holy bond infused with divine significance. In doing so, the Church infused even the most personal aspects of affection and intimacy with moral scrutiny. Central to this transformation was the idea that marriage was not merely a legal pact, but a spiritual commitment, one that symbolized the union between Christ and his Church. This elevated status, however, came with rules, many of them deeply restrictive. Marriages had to be monogamous, permanent, and open to procreation. Any deviation from this structure, be it lust outside of wedlock, remarriage after divorce, or sexual activity without the intent of producing children, was condemned as sin. The physical expression of love was not, in itself, celebrated. It was tolerated within very specific limits, and always viewed with suspicion. The Church categorized sexual sins meticulously. Fornication, sex outside of marriage, was punishable by penance, public shame, or fines. Adultery was condemned with particular vehemence, threatening the sanctity of both marriage and social order. Even within marriage, not all acts were considered acceptable. Intercourse was permitted only for the purpose of reproduction. Acts of pleasure alone were frowned upon, sometimes even labeled sinful. The belief was that unchecked passion, even between husband and wife, could lead the soul astray. To enforce these norms, the Church developed an extensive system of canon law. Priests were trained not only to preach and perform sacraments, but also to hear confessions and assign penance for sins of the flesh. Manuals were written, thick, detailed texts that instructed confessors how to question penitents and what punishment to assign for each transgression. The bedroom was no longer a private place. It became a confessional battleground, where sin might be whispered beneath sheets and answered with prayer or punishment. Public rituals further reinforced the Church's authority over marriage. Weddings had to be performed before a priest and in the presence of witnesses to be considered valid. Secret marriages, once common among the nobility, were gradually outlawed. Bans, public announcements of intent to marry, were required in many dioceses, allowing time for any objections based on kinship, previous vows or other impediments to be voiced. The Church's control was not just spiritual, but administrative. No union escaped its gaze. It also imposed strict rules about who could marry whom. Degrees of consanguinity, blood relation, were expanded beyond the immediate family, forbidding unions between distant cousins or anyone within 7 degrees of relation, as measured by canon law. These rules were difficult to interpret without clerical help, and served to involve the Church further in every proposed match. A couple wishing to marry might have to seek a dispensation, a formal permission, from a bishop, or even the Pope, reinforcing the institution's central role. For those who wished to avoid the moral burdens of marriage altogether, the Church offered alternatives: chastity, celibacy, and the religious life. Monks and nuns were held as models of purity, having rejected not only sexual pleasure, but even the potential of romantic entanglement. Virginity, particularly for women, was glorified as a holy state, a gift to God. Saints were venerated for their abstinence, not their love. To remain untouched was to be sanctified. Yet, even as it imposed these standards, the Church acknowledged the presence of human weakness. Penance was possible, redemption was offered, but the message was clear: love, desire, and sexual union were not free expressions of the heart. They were activities to be monitored, disciplined, and purified. The body was not celebrated. It was a vessel of temptation, to be subdued through confession and obedience. This ecclesiastical framework turned the act of choosing a partner, or even thinking about intimacy, into a matter of spiritual consequence. The stakes were eternal. A poorly considered union, an impure thought, or a moment of physical indulgence could, in theory, threaten salvation. Dating in this context was not merely discouraged, it was dangerous. To pursue affection outside the clear channels of Church-approved engagement was to flirt not only with scandal but with damnation. In time, the Church's influence would soften in certain corners of Europe, challenged by secular rulers or tempered by reformers. But for many centuries, it remained the dominant voice on matters of the heart. It dictated not only who one could love, but how, when, and for what purpose. Passion was permitted only within the confines of sacrament. Outside those lines, it became sin. Thus, in medieval Europe, the Church did not simply preach morality, it enforced it. Through law, ritual, and fear, it transformed the most intimate parts of life into a liturgy of discipline. Love, that wild and unpredictable force, was bent to the shape of doctrine, and in doing so, it ensured that for most, dating was not a pathway to joy, but a minefield of rules, watched over by priests and parish records, and shadowed always by the distant threat of eternal judgment. Beneath the castle walls and far from the manicured courts where nobles arranged dynastic unions, lay a very different world: the villages, hamlets, and thatched roof huts of the medieval peasantry. Here, among muddy fields and smoky hearths, life moved to a rhythm not of chivalric poetry or saintly sermons, but of necessity. Hunger, weather, toil, these were the forces that governed daily existence. In this world, love, at least the kind we understand today, was a luxury few could afford. Marriage, for the average peasant, was not an act of romance, but a decision rooted in survival, labor sharing, and the pragmatic need to secure a working partnership in an unforgiving world. The average peasant's life was consumed by labor. From the moment the first light crept over the horizon, men and women were awake, preparing to till fields, herd livestock, draw water, gather firewood, or mend tools and clothing. Days were long, often stretching from dawn until dusk, and even children were put to work as soon as they were physically able. There was no dating scene, no dances, no letters, no long walks beneath moonlit skies. There simply wasn't time. The burdens of survival left little space for dreamy conversations or emotional courtship. Instead, unions among peasants were arranged with practicality at the forefront. A man needed a wife who could cook, tend to a garden, bear children, and help in the fields. A woman needed a husband who could provide protection, plow the land, and maintain the thatch overhead. The choice of a spouse was made with eyes wide open to the demands of life, not the fluttering of the heart. The idea of marrying purely for affection was as distant to a peasant as the stars that wheeled silently over their thatched roofs each night. Marriage was less about companionship and more about continuity, producing heirs, sharing burdens, and ensuring that no one faced the harsh world alone. Many peasants lived in small, tight-knit communities, and the pool of potential spouses was limited to those who lived nearby. Most villagers married people they had known since childhood, not because of deep, evolving romance, but because proximity made the choice efficient. There were no grand journeys to find a beloved in another county, and certainly no thoughts of marrying into wealth or status. Such aspirations were not only unlikely, they were unthinkable. Class divisions were rigid and absolute. A peasant could not marry upward without extraordinary and rare circumstances, and even then, social pressures often forced such unions to dissolve or fail in secrecy. Even among peasants, however, approval was still required. The local lord held considerable sway over village life, and serfs, those legally bound to the land, needed permission to marry. This was not mere bureaucracy. It was control over human relationships as a form of property management. A marriage that moved a woman from one manor to another could mean a loss of labor for her original lord. Fees were sometimes charged for such permissions, further tying love, or at least marriage, to the economics of feudalism. The church too had its influence, even in the smallest villages. Marriages were supposed to be sanctified by a priest, and witnessed by the community. Public bans were read aloud to prevent illicit unions, and even peasants were expected to follow canon law, however poorly understood. Yet, in the isolation of some rural places, informal unions still occurred. Couples might simply begin living together, with or without official approval. These relationships could later be legitimized by the church if need or scandal required, but they were never encouraged. Even the poor were expected to conform to the moral and structural expectations of a society that preached obedience from every pulpit. And yet, even in these bleak conditions, traces of affection sometimes found their way through the cracks. A shared laugh while tending livestock, a secret smile exchanged at the village well, a bond formed through mutual hardship. These were the quiet, fragile embers of connection that could in time kindle into something more. But such moments were brief and precarious, easily snuffed out by death, disease, or a poor harvest. Romantic love, if it emerged at all, was an accident, not an expectation. Survival came first. Everything else, sentiment, desire, even joy, came second, if it came at all. Children often followed quickly after marriage, and families were large out of necessity, not sentiment. Each child was another set of hands for the fields, another worker to help sustain the family. But childbirth was dangerous, and many women died young, worn down by pregnancies, infections, and the unending labor of rural life. Men, too, faced short lifespans, their bodies broken by work or disease. Widows and widowers remarried quickly, not out of grief or longing, but because the work could not stop, and no one could carry the load alone. In this world, the realities of life crushed the myths of romance. Love, as we know it, unpredictable, poetic, and emotional, was largely irrelevant. The medieval peasant did not swipe, flirt, or court. He chose, or was assigned, a partner, and together they endured. Their union was not built on roses and sonnets, but on wooden ploughs, cold winters, and the ever-present fear of famine. There was no time for courtship. There was only time for work. And so, dating, if it existed at all, was merely a whisper, a faint idea that flickered occasionally in the minds of those too poor to dream. For them, love was not a story. It was a footnote in a ledger of debts, duties, and daily drudgery. In the candle-lit halls of castles, and among the carefully penned pages of illuminated manuscripts, there arose a concept that seemed to defy the grim practicalities of medieval life, a notion so delicate, so alluring, and yet so entirely disconnected from the world in which it was born. This was courtly love, an ethereal construct of longing, ritualized devotion, and poetic suffering. It fluttered like a silk banner over the heads of the privileged, whispered about in noble courts, captured in the rhymed stanzas of troubadours, and painted in the margins of vellum. But like many fantasies, it lived not in reality, but in its distance from it. Courtly love did not belong to peasants or merchants or labourers. It was a plaything of the aristocracy, confined to the privileged classes who had the time, literacy, and detachment from survival to entertain such ideas. It had emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in southern France, the Languedoc region, and spread through the courts of Aquitaine, Provence, and later into the broader territories of England and northern Europe. It was here in the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and others like her, that the ideals of love were cultivated like rare roses, carefully, ritualistically, and completely divorced from the dusty world beyond the tapestried walls. At its core, courtly love was not about marriage, family, or even mutual commitment. Rather, it was about admiration, a stylized, almost religious veneration of an unattainable beloved, usually a noble lady already married to someone else. The man, often a knight or a poet, would place himself in emotional bondage to this woman, pledging loyalty, service, and undying affection. He might wear her colors into battle, compose verses in her honor, or spend months in melancholy reflection, all without the expectation of consummation. In fact, the very impossibility of fulfillment was part of its appeal. Courtly love thrived on distance, secrecy, and emotional torment. It was less about love than it was about longing. The rules of this tradition were rigid, almost ritualistic. Love had to be secret, it had to be difficult, and it had to involve suffering. A knight might kneel before a lady as if before a queen or a saint, offering his sword and soul. She, in turn, would withhold affection, testing his devotion through silence, tasks, or mock indifference. These relationships were often intentionally adulterous in structure, designed not to disrupt marriage, but to exist in a separate symbolic sphere. Courtly love made no effort to change the institution of marriage, because marriage was seen not as a venue for affection, but as a legal and social contract. Romance was something else entirely, a private game played by the powerful, but this game had consequences. Though wrapped in poetry and cloaked in metaphor, courtly love flirted with danger. For in a society where chastity and lineage were closely guarded, even symbolic infidelities could ignite suspicion. The Church was wary of courtly love, condemning its elevation of lust and secrecy. Preachers warned against the temptation of romantic idolatry, seeing in it a path toward moral collapse. Yet it persisted, not because it represented truth, but because it offered an escape. It allowed nobles to imagine a world where love was not arranged, not transactional, but freely given and freely withheld. It was a myth built on the backs of those who could afford myths, and it was always a performance. Few who engaged in courtly love believed in it as a genuine path to union. Instead, it was art, a dance of glances, verses and silences. Troubadours and trouvères gave it voice in songs that wandered across Europe, from the courts of France to the halls of England and beyond. They sang of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, not as cautionary tales, but as exalted models of passion. Even as these stories often ended in tragedy, their emotional resonance continued to shape how the privileged imagined love, setting it apart from the dry realities of duty-bound marriages. But for all its beauty, courtly love was never meant to reach beyond the palace walls. It offered nothing to the millions who lived without luxury or literacy. It did not change the laws that bound women, or the customs that arranged marriages before adolescence. It offered no real guidance for partnership, no model for raising children or surviving famine or plague. It was a theatre of sentiment, a beautiful fiction, and one that only highlighted, through contrast, the lack of real choice most people faced. Even for those within its sphere, courtly love rarely brought joy. Its rituals demanded restraint, its expectations invited betrayal, and its outcomes were often sorrowful. It created a world in which suffering was romantic, where absence was desirable, and where intimacy, if it occurred at all, marked the end of the enchantment. It was not a recipe for happiness, but a blueprint for longing. In time, courtly love would shape the romantic ideals of later centuries, influencing Renaissance literature, and eventually feeding into modern concepts of romantic love. But in the Middle Ages, it remained a fragile illusion. Beautiful, yes, but as untouchable as the moon reflected in a still pool. In a world where marriages were transactions, where women's voices were silenced, and where even nobles could not always choose their partners, courtly love offered something rare, the illusion of agency, and like all illusions, it shimmered brightly, just out of reach. There was perhaps no single attribute more guarded, discussed, feared, and mythologized in medieval society than female virginity. Not beauty, not wealth, not even piety carried the same weight when it came to the fate of a young woman's life. Virginity, that invisible condition, that fragile proof of worth, became the cornerstone of a woman's reputation, the seal of her family's honor, and the silent currency in countless marital transactions. And so, behind the heavy oak doors of manor houses, and the thatched roofs of peasant huts alike, the burden of sexual purity fell almost exclusively on women, a weight that began in childhood, and lingered through life, not with gentle whispers, but with the constant shadow of shame and social ruin. The preservation of virginity before marriage was not simply a personal virtue, it was a social imperative. A daughter's chastity represented the moral standing of her entire family. In noble households, it also had material consequences. A pure bride ensured uncontested inheritance, legitimate heirs, and continued alliances between dynasties. Without it, a young woman risked more than disapproval. She could be cast out, disowned, or even forced into a convent, her future locked behind stone walls as penance for desire, real or imagined. And it was not merely intercourse that was policed. The boundaries extended to glances, conversations, and proximity. Even the suggestion of impropriety could stain a reputation beyond repair. Among the more curious and controversial symbols of this era's obsession with chastity was the chastity belt, a device that has captured the modern imagination, equal parts grotesque and theatrical, often made of iron, with intricate locking mechanisms. These belts were allegedly used to ensure that women remained untouched while their husbands were away, particularly during the Crusades. But the historical truth is far murkier. Most surviving examples are from later centuries, and were likely created as hoaxes or museum curiosities. Scholars today largely agree that while the myth of the chastity belt was widely circulated, especially in Renaissance literature and Victorian imaginations, their actual use in the medieval period was extremely rare, if not entirely non-existent. Still, the fact that such a concept took root and endured reveals much about the cultural climate of fear, control, and deep unease surrounding female sexuality. For many women, virginity was a performance they were expected to enact with unwavering consistency. They were to walk modestly, speak softly, dress conservatively, and express no personal desire. Their bodies were considered vessels of honor or disgrace, but rarely their own. On wedding nights, it was not uncommon for families to demand evidence of consummation, often in the form of stained bedsheets, publicly displayed as proof of both the bride's purity and the groom's success. This humiliating ritual, often mythologized or dramatized, underscored the extent to which sex was never a private matter. It was a communal concern, weighed and judged as if morality itself depended upon it. But virginity was never simply about physical integrity, it was about submission. A woman's worth was measured not only by whether she had engaged in sexual activity, but by her perceived willingness to obey, to accept the control of her father, then her husband, without question, and if she failed in this regard, even subtly, the consequences could be devastating. Accusations of unchastity could lead to social exile, forced confessions, or even accusations of witchcraft, especially in later centuries. In some communities, a dishonored woman might be married off hastily to an older man, sent to a convent, or shamed into silence. For many, the fear of dishonor was not hypothetical, it was an ever-present threat. This fear extended beyond women themselves. Men, too, were gripped by the anxiety of sexual betrayal. A wife's infidelity could threaten a man's lineage, property, and pride. Stories of cuckoldry, both real and imagined, flooded medieval literature, not as comedic tropes, as they sometimes appear now, but as terrifying reminders of male vulnerability. Thus, control over female sexuality became a form of protection, not of the woman, but of the male ego, the family legacy, and societal structure. And so, women were taught to fear themselves, their desires, and the world that watched them. Yet even in such a tightly wound web of expectations, cracks existed. Behind closed doors and within whispered conversations, not every woman remained silent. Some resisted, some transgressed, some even found love on their own terms, though often at great personal risk. Folk tales and ballads sometimes told of maidens who followed their hearts, who defied betrothals and eloped with lovers. These stories, though few, offered brief glimpses of resistance in a world dominated by fear. Still, they remained the exception, not the rule. In the end, the medieval obsession with virginity did more than shape individual lives. It reinforced an entire system of control. It told women that their bodies were never fully their own, that their choices could destroy not only themselves, but those around them. It created a culture of suspicion and silence, where innocence had to be guarded like treasure, and any deviation, even imagined, could become a life sentence. In such a world, love was not a beginning, but a threat. The story of virginity in the Middle Ages is not simply about abstinence, it is a story about power, who holds it, who loses it, and how fear becomes a tool for shaping generations. As we drift deeper into the dim corridors of history, the echoes of these expectations still linger, whispering of a time when purity was more than personal. It was political, public, and profoundly punitive. There was, in the long, flickering quiet of medieval nights, a kind of yearning that dared not speak its name aloud, a longing that passed not through public vows or stolen embraces, but through parchment and ink, sealed with wax and risk, and carried, often at great personal danger, by hands that did not belong to the writer or the beloved. In an age where romance was either forbidden or functionally irrelevant, and where proximity often meant surveillance rather than intimacy, the written word became a lifeline. It was through letters, carefully scripted, cryptically phrased, and sometimes never sent, that love could be imagined, performed, and preserved. Particularly among the literate classes, nobles, clergy, and courtly elites, the love letter evolved into both a confessional and an art form. It allowed feelings that could not be spoken aloud to find shape. The ink served as a proxy for touch, the sealed letter for a kiss denied. These missives, often composed in Latin or vernacular tongues like Old French or Provençal, followed a stylized formula: expressions of loyalty, lamentations over absence, idealized praise of the beloved, and pleas for mercy or recognition. The distance between writer and recipient was both physical and social, a chasm often filled not with real closeness, but with literary performance. In this way, love letters became both deeply personal and completely conventional. They adhered to the tropes of fin amour, or refined love, which flourished in the traditions of troubadours and the courts of love. The beloved was described in exalted, almost spiritual terms, as radiant, pure, unreachable, while the writer presented themselves as a suffering soul, humble and devoted, unworthy yet unwavering. The pain of separation was not merely emotional, it was ennobling. Suffering in love was, in this tradition, a virtue, and writing became the most acceptable form of endurance. It is important to remember that many of these letters were not entirely private. In the noble courts, it was not unusual for scribes to compose love letters on behalf of their lords or ladies, especially if the sender lacked the skill or education to write poetically. These scribes, often trained in rhetoric and classical forms, crafted elaborate metaphors and allusions, sometimes borrowing lines from Ovid or the Song of Songs. In this way, love was both real and artificial, an emotional truth dressed in borrowed language. The message may have been heartfelt, but its execution was often the work of someone else's hand, and yet the danger was real. These letters were not exchanged casually. Every missive was a risk, a potential weapon if intercepted. In a time when even glances could be misinterpreted, a written declaration of love could result in disgrace, imprisonment, or death. Servants were sometimes bribed to deliver letters in secret, slipping them under doors or hiding them in prayer books. Trusted confidants became intermediaries, ferrying words between separated hearts while always risking exposure. A misplaced line or a stolen scroll could bring ruin, especially if the lovers were from rival houses, or worse, if one or both were already married. The very existence of the letter was incriminating. It spoke not only of feeling, but of intent, a dangerous thing in a world built on control. Among women, particularly noble women, who lived in physical and social confinement, letters became a way to reach beyond the narrow spaces of their lives. A wife sequestered in her husband's keep might pour her longing onto vellum for a distant night, or compose a poem of lamentation for a love she could never claim. In some rare cases, women wrote in their own hand, but more often, they dictated to a trusted servant or clerk. The act itself was subversive, a reclaiming of voice in a world that expected silence. Many of these letters did not survive the centuries. Paper rotted, wax cracked. Secrets, by their nature, were destroyed. But some fragments remain, preserved in court records, literary manuscripts, and collections of noble correspondence. These documents offer glimpses into lives lived in the margins of expectation. They show us that even within systems of repression, human hearts beat stubbornly, not with rebellion, necessarily, but with quiet longing. A baroness writing to a troubadour, a squire composing a verse to a lady far above his station, a nun penning a line of regret to the man she had left behind. These were not the loud stories of history, but the soft murmurs in between. One of the most striking examples comes from the Ars Amatoria tradition, manuals and letter collections that served as both models for lovers and voyeuristic entertainment for the court. These stylized letters, sometimes fictional, blurred the line between reality and performance. They allowed readers to indulge in fantasy while reinforcing the conventions of love as a noble torment. In this way, literature and life fed each other, with fictional lovers inspiring real ones, and vice versa. The line between genuine feeling and rhetorical flourish was intentionally thin. Clergy, too, were not immune. Though bound by vows of celibacy, many priests and monks found themselves writing or receiving love letters, sometimes directed toward noble women, sometimes to fellow clergy. These correspondences, deeply suppressed, often came to light only when discovered and punished. In the monasteries, the act of writing became an emotional outlet. Illuminated initials, careful calligraphy, and poetic margins allowed for the quiet transmission of unsanctioned feeling, even if never openly admitted. Letters were not only tools of romantic exchange, but also artifacts of longing that had no outlet in daily life. For most, especially those in arranged or loveless marriages, the love letter became a kind of escape, a personal world constructed in ink where fantasy could live. Some never sent their letters at all. They were hidden in chests, sewn into hems buried beneath floorboards. Writing them was enough. To name the feeling, even if no one ever read it, was to keep something human alive, and always, surrounding these letters, was lament. Songs of longing, verses of absence. The trope of the distant lover appeared again and again in medieval literature, not because it was rare, but because it was so common. Physical separation, social barriers, moral law, all conspired to keep love at a distance. In this way, medieval love letters were not triumphs. They were acts of endurance, written in the shadow of impossibility. Thus, in a time where marriage was arranged, public affection was dangerous, and gender roles were violently enforced, love from afar became the safest form of love. It asked for nothing, it threatened no contracts. It was quiet, loyal, invisible, a ghost that could live in the space between lines, and so the letter remained, folded carefully, hidden well, and never spoken of again. In the slow-turning gears of medieval society, marriage was not a private affair of hearts or an expression of individual longing. It was, above all else, a transaction sometimes veiled in ritual, sometimes cloaked in piety, but at its core, deeply economic. In fields where grain barely sustained the mouths it fed, and in manors where lineage determined every measure of status, marriage was a contract signed not in kisses but in coin, land, livestock, and promises of future obligation. The world of matrimony was a market, and in this market, every bride and groom had a price, whether measured in gold, acres, or head of cattle. Love was not absent, but it came only after the ledgers had been balanced. The dowry, that ever-present token of a family's investment in their daughter's future, was both symbol and burden. It represented a family's ability to secure alliances, to transfer wealth, and to affirm their daughter's worth. But more often than not, it was a heavy weight, one that drove families into poverty, or left younger daughters unmarried, their hopes of a household of their own quietly suffocated by the limits of coin. The dowry was not a gift freely given. It was a necessity extracted by expectation. In noble circles, dowries could stretch into fortunes, entire estates, villages, or vaults of silver. Among peasants, they might be a single pig, a woven blanket, a bolt of wool, or a crude iron pot, all that could be spared, sometimes painfully borrowed, with the hope that it would buy not just a husband, but a future. For wealthier families, dowries were carefully negotiated. Not unlike the sale of property, formal contracts were drawn, stipulating the terms, what would be paid now, what would follow upon childbirth, and what would revert should the husband die. Lawyers, stewards, and scribes were often involved, even if the groom and bride themselves were never consulted. These arrangements were not just about money, they were about reputation. A large dowry could elevate a daughter into a better match, align her with a family of higher station, and ensure that her children would inherit more than just name. A small dowry, on the other hand, relegated her to lesser matches, or worse, to the cloister, where unwed daughters were sometimes placed as a means of sidestepping the costly business of marrying them off. The reverse also existed, the bride price. Though less common in later medieval Europe, especially in the Christian West, bride prices persisted in earlier periods, and among some regions, particularly in rural communities, and among non-Christian populations. The bride price was a sum paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, a recognition, it was said, of the loss of her labor, her presence, her womb. Where dowries signaled a family's effort to marry a daughter into another household, bride prices suggested that daughters were, in a grim sense, being bought. Yet in some ways, the bride price offered protection. It allowed the bride's family to retain a form of leverage, and in certain regions, it was held in trust for the bride herself, to be used in the event of widowhood or mistreatment. Regardless of direction, these marital finances had a punishing logic. Families with many daughters struggled desperately to accumulate dowries for them all, often prioritizing the eldest while younger sisters were left to wait, sometimes forever. Among the poor, this led to countless young women remaining unmarried, not by choice, but by simple economic inability. A girl without a dowry was a burden to her family, and a risk to any prospective groom. She might be sent to work in another household, relegated to the role of spinster, or in some cases, taken by the church, which, for a modest fee, would accept her into a convent, where she would serve in quiet penance for the marriage she never had. In towns where guilds and trades offered slightly more fluid social mobility, the economic calculations of marriage were no less rigid. A merchant might seek a bride whose dowry included shares in a warehouse or the rights to a mill. A master craftsman might marry the daughter of a rival to secure access to clientele or resources. In such cases, love was not entirely absent. Affection could grow, or at least coexist, with mutual benefit. but the arrangement always came first. The numbers were tallied long before the vows were spoken. The nobility, of course, elevated these practices to Baroque levels. Marriages were arranged across regions and kingdoms, with dowries negotiated in embassies, not parlors. A noblewoman's dowry might include land rights, military alliances, or long-standing feudal obligations. Entire wars were fought over unpaid dowries, or disputed inheritances stemming from broken marriage contracts. One such case was that of Margaret of Anjou, whose marriage to Henry VI of England included a disputed dowry that added tension to the already volatile Wars of the Roses. In such circles, the bride was merely the vessel through which land and bloodline flowed. Her feelings were irrelevant, her consent often assumed. For the groom, marriage was often the fastest way to wealth or power. A younger son, lacking inheritance, might marry an heiress, and thereby leapfrog his older brother in fortune. In some cases, marriages were orchestrated between children, betrothals formalized when the bride was still in her cradle, and finalized when she reached the age of fertility. These were cold calculations, made not with hearts but with ledgers. The girl's readiness for childbirth mattered more than her readiness for partnership. Dowries could also backfire. If a woman's dowry was large, and her husband squandered it through gambling, mismanagement, or war, her family had little recourse. Widows with no dowry left were often forced to return home, shamed and penniless. If the husband died before children were born, disputes often arose about whether the dowry should be returned or retained. In some regions, the dowry became the woman's morgengab, her mourning gift, to be used for her security in widowhood. But this was not always honored. The practice varied wildly by region, class, and ecclesiastical interpretation. Ultimately, the dowry system perpetuated a world in which women were not agents but assets. Their value was measured in coin, cloth, and cattle. Their futures were sold, not shared. While individual cases might allow for affection, and while some marriages blossomed into genuine companionship, the broader system was one of transaction, and it was a system that crushed families, particularly those with ambition but not enough wealth. In this way, the marriage market of the medieval world was both familiar and alien. It reminds us that beneath the rituals and prayers, beneath the veils and vows, there was a harsh arithmetic at work. Marriage was not just a bond between two people, it was a strategy for survival, a negotiation between households, and a gamble that often cost more than it gave. And through it all, love, true, foolish, unprofitable love, sat quietly in the shadows, waiting to be permitted, if only after everything else had been paid. In the great tapestry of medieval society, where marriage was the common destiny and procreation the sacred duty, there existed a thread that wove a different path, one that turned inward rather than outward, one that abandoned the obligations of courtship, family and passion for a life of silence, order, and prayer. It was a path defined not by love stories but by cloisters and candles, by vows whispered under stone arches, and by a conscious, often permanent departure from the world's entanglements. This was the life of monks and nuns, men and women who lived without the kiss, without the wedding ring, and without the murmur of romantic dreams. Celibacy, in the medieval church, was not merely an ideal, it was a cornerstone. For those who truly sought to serve God, or who were placed, often without their consent, into that service, the flesh was to be mastered, not indulged. In monasteries and convents, walls were not just physical barriers against the world, they were spiritual shields, intended to guard the soul from temptation, from lust, from the distractions of the heart. And yet, behind those high stone enclosures, the human heart did not always forget how to beat. The decision to enter monastic life was not always freely made. For noble families with too many children, and not enough land to divide, the church offered a convenient solution. A second or third son might be given to a monastery before he reached his 12th birthday, set on a course that would spare his family from having to fund a dowry or inheritance. Daughters too might be placed into convents, particularly if the family could not afford a suitable dowry, or if the marriage market had grown too competitive. In some cases, this was done with ceremony and joy, with the child paraded to the abbey in rich robes, offered as a bride of Christ. In other instances, it was done in silence, cloaked in regret, as a necessary sacrifice for the survival of the rest. Once within, life moved to a different rhythm. The bell marked the passing of hours, not the sun. The body was clothed in wool, the hair often shorn. Meals were simple, often meatless, sometimes silent. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed in many orders, called for a life of humility, obedience and chastity. The desires of the flesh were to be quelled through fasting, prayer, and labor. The day was divided into fixed times for divine office, study, manual work, and reflection. For monks this might mean long hours copying texts, tending to gardens, or maintaining the monastery's grounds. For nuns it often meant sewing, teaching young girls, or nursing the sick. Romantic love in this world was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. A single longing glance, an ill-timed word, could lead to scandal, expulsion, or penance. And yet the human spirit does not always submit quietly. Historical records, faded with age and inked in careful Latin, speak of transgressions, both subtle and shocking. There are letters between monks and nuns, secret rendezvous in cloistered gardens, and even rare cases of children born behind convent walls. The Church punished such lapses harshly, yet they occurred all the same, reminders that no wall could fully contain the complexities of desire. But not all who entered monastic life did so unwillingly. For some it was a genuine calling, a chance to escape the burdens of a chaotic world, to pursue learning, serenity, and spiritual clarity. Especially for women, the convent could be a rare place of autonomy. A noble woman might rise to become a abbess, ruling over her community with more authority than she could have ever wielded as a wife. She might oversee estates, manage finances, commission manuscripts, and correspond with bishops and kings. Within these walls, some women found a power and peace that the outside world refused them. Monasteries were not merely places of prayer, they were centers of literacy, medicine, and knowledge. A young man who entered the cloister might learn to read and write, might study the works of Aristotle or Augustine, might eventually become an advisor to a prince or a chronicler of his age. The celibate life was not one of total isolation. Monastic orders had vast networks, connections that spanned kingdoms. Pilgrims visited, nobles donated. The world came to the monastery's gates, even if the monks and nuns did not go out to meet it. Still, the absence of romantic opportunity defined this life in profound ways. While the rest of the world danced at harvest festivals, traded glances in market squares, and whispered beneath moonlit windows, the monk or nun retired to a narrow cell, a wooden bench, a candle and a psalter. The emotional energies that in others might ignite passion or infatuation were redirected into devotion, self-discipline, and contemplation. Love in this space was spiritual, not romantic, but divine. The soul was to be wedded not to another person, but to God. And yet traces of longing remained. In the poetry of cloistered scribes, we find metaphors of love that echo courtship, the soul yearning for Christ as a lover for his beloved, the heart aching for union with the divine. The language of mysticism often blurred the line between spiritual and sensual. Saints like Bernard of Clairvaux or Catherine of Siena wrote with fervor that to the modern ear sounds almost romantic. In this way the monastery was not devoid of emotion, but full of it, transformed, redirected, but still deeply felt. Some found joy in this life. Others, quiet sorrow, and still others found peace. A stillness that the world could not provide. They lived without the touch of a partner, without the thrill of flirtation, without the heartbreak of rejection, or the joy of reunion. Their lives were measured not in love letters or kisses, but in prayers, penances, and the turning of the seasons outside their cloistered walls. The celibate life was not an escape, nor a punishment, though it could feel like either. It was a parallel world, running silently beside the noisy roads of courtship, marriage, and desire. It offered its own rewards, its own challenges, and its own truths about what it means to live without romantic love, not out of failure or rejection, but by deliberate sacred choice. And in that quiet world, where the heart beat slower, and the days passed with solemn regularity, Another kind of love flickered gently, not passionate, not possessive, but enduring, a love for silence, a love for stillness, a love for something beyond flesh and longing, carried on candlelight and whispered in Latin, far from the hurried passions of the world outside, in a world ruled as much by custom as by crown, where divine law was often more feared than royal decree. Love, especially the forbidden kind, carried a price so steep it could ruin reputations, tear apart families, or end a life entirely. The heart, in medieval times, did not beat freely. It beat in chains, watched closely by priests and neighbors alike, and when it beat where it shouldn't, toward a forbidden partner, a secret lover, or someone bound to another, it risked triggering not passion, but punishment. For in the brittle, careful latticework of medieval morality, forbidden love was not just a personal failing, it was a public crime, and one that had to be corrected with severity, shame, and sometimes blood. To stray from the boundaries of lawful affection, to engage in adultery, to seduce another's spouse, to marry in secret without church approval, was to violate not only human law, but divine order. Marriage, as the church defined it, was a holy sacrament. It was to be entered into under clerical supervision, witnessed, and sanctified with ritual. To pursue intimacy outside of these bounds was to risk damnation. But while the threat of eternal punishment loomed large in the sermons and confessions, the consequences in the temporal world could be far more immediate and far more brutal. Adultery, especially when committed by women, was regarded as a stain upon the household and an affront to the honor of the husband, and by extension, the entire community. A husband cuckolded was a man made a fool, and such humiliation demanded visible, irreversible correction. All women caught in adultery, or even suspected of it, could face savage penalties, ranging from mutilation to execution. In parts of medieval France, a woman found guilty of adultery might be publicly whipped, her hair shorn as a mark of disgrace, and then forced to march through the streets in a shift, barefoot, jeered at by a crowd trained to scorn rather than sympathize. In harsher judgments, a branded letter might be seared into her forehead or cheek, often an A for adulteress, a lifelong scar of moral failure. The punishments were not always fatal, but they were always meant to humiliate. Public shame was more than spectacle, it was pedagogy. The crowd that gathered to watch a woman placed in the stocks, or to see a man dragged through the square for seduction of another's wife, was not just there for entertainment, though entertain they did, but to be reminded of the boundaries they dared not cross. In some places, convicted lovers were forced to wear symbolic garments, tunics turned inside out, bells sewn into their hems, heavy iron yokes strapped to their necks, all designed to announce, without words, the nature of their transgression. Men, of course, were not entirely exempt, though the imbalance of power often shielded them. A man who seduced a woman of lower status might escape with a fine, a pilgrimage as penance, or a temporary excommunication. But if he had dishonored a noble woman, or violated a virgin under the protection of a family, the consequences could be swift and merciless. Castration was not unheard of, nor was death, especially when fathers, brothers, or husbands took justice into their own hands, a concept sometimes called vendetta d'honneur, or revenge for honor. In such cases, the law might turn a blind eye, quietly approving of blood spilt in the name of family dignity. Secret marriages, those performed without banns, witnesses, or ecclesiastical sanction, also invited retribution. The church insisted on transparency, both to avoid unions between close kin and to prevent coercion. But young lovers, desperate to escape arranged marriages or family control, sometimes turned to clandestine vows exchanged in dark chapels or forest groves. When discovered, these unions could be annulled, the participants excommunicated, and the priest who officiated, punished with suspension or exile. The woman, if pregnant, bore the greatest burden, shunned by community, abandoned by family, and labeled a fallen creature. Even consensual premarital sex, known then as fornication, did not escape the punitive gaze of church and society. If discovered, it could lead to heavy penance, a public confession, a series of fasts, or even pilgrimage to distant shrines. Repeat offenders were punished more harshly. A woman who bore a child out of wedlock could be fined or exiled, and her child branded with the social mark of bastardy, forbidden from holding certain offices or inheriting titles. Perhaps most chilling were the punishments reserved for those who loved in ways considered not only improper, but unnatural. Homosexuality, labeled sodomy by the Church, was not merely frowned upon but criminalized with intensity. The laws varied across kingdoms and centuries, but in many places, the punishment was death, often by fire. Those caught in same-sex liaisons were tried in ecclesiastical courts, subjected to interrogation and torture, and if convicted, were condemned to burn as an example to others. Such executions were carried out with solemn ceremony, a declaration not just of justice, but of moral purification. Yet even the most merciless punishments could not fully suppress the force of desire. Forbidden love did not vanish beneath the threat of the lash or the brand. It simply learned to hide. Lovers met in shadowed corners, exchanged glances at feasts, passed notes tucked inside prayer books or under cloaks. They invented codes, used intermediaries, or disguised their intentions as spiritual friendship. Passion, though punished, endured. In the countryside, peasants sometimes risked everything for affection, a tryst in a barn, a whispered vow before the village priest. In the cities, merchants' daughters and apprentices carved out stolen moments among the alleyways and candlelit rooms. Nobles arranged love affairs under the cover of protocol, disguising visits as matters of state. Even within monasteries and convents, supposedly sanctuaries of chastity, rumors of illicit affections sometimes swirled, with letters seized, confessions extracted, and punishments handed down in darkness. At its heart, the medieval obsession with punishing forbidden love was not merely about morality, but about control. Love had power, the power to disrupt family plans, to defy political alliances, to challenge ecclesiastical authority. A love that stepped outside the ordained bounds was a threat not just to a marriage contract, but to the fragile architecture of society itself, and so it was policed, with cruelty and consistency, across courts, churches, and communities. The consequences of this control reverberated beyond the punished. They created a climate of fear, in which affection was cautious, desire whispered, and courtship wrapped in layers of ritual and restraint. They taught generations to equate love with danger, and to see passion not as a gift, but a temptation to be mastered, or crushed. Yet for all that, the human heart remained defiantly disobedient. It reached out in longing, even as it risked shame. It whispered, even under the threat of silence. And in that tension between law and love, between punishment and passion, the medieval world lived out its quiet, conflicted romances, many never recorded, but deeply felt. In a world often imagined to be ruled by emotionless feudal lords and ironclad absolutes, the medieval landscape was in fact brimming with the murky fingerprints of the human heart. Disappointments, betrayals, misunderstandings and quiet longings, laid bare not in poetry, but in parchment. Across the dim chambers of manorial halls, civic tribunals, and ecclesiastical courts, a quieter kind of drama unfolded. Here, beneath the solemn eyes of scribes and judges, love was debated, dissected, and deliberated. These were not the love stories sung by troubadours, or whispered in castle gardens. They were recorded in ink, bound in legal terminology, and archived among disputes over oxen and land. In these pages, we find lawsuits over broken betrothals, dowries gone missing, and accusations of seduction, all examined with the dry, steady hand of law. For the medieval mind, love and law were not wholly separate spheres. Affection was not simply a feeling, it was a contract, a promise, and in many cases a transaction. When promises were made and broken, it was not just the heart that suffered, but the social order, and thus, courts became the quiet custodians of betrayed expectations. A betrothal, though not yet a marriage, carried legal weight. If a man swore to marry a woman, and she reorganized her life in anticipation, perhaps turning down other suitors, or even consummating the promise in secret, then later changed his mind, he could be brought before a judge. Records from English ecclesiastical courts in the 14th and 15th centuries abound with such cases. A woman might appear, veil lowered, voice trembling, holding a small piece of cloth embroidered with the initials of a promise made in a field or at a feast. She might recite the words he had spoken, "I plight thee my troth," and argue that by such words, witnessed or not, she had become his lawful wife. The man might deny it, claiming drunkenness, jest, or misremembered affection. The court, often staffed by clergy well versed in both canon law and human frailty, would examine the testimony, consider witness accounts, and decide whether a binding union had been formed. These cases rarely hinged on romance. They turned instead on intention and evidence. If witnesses had heard the exchange of vows, or if the couple had shared a bed under the promise of future marriage, the union might be declared valid. If not, the woman might be left to bear the consequences, often social ruin or an illegitimate child, without legal remedy. In such a world, even words spoken in passing could become anchors, dragging two people into a legal entanglement that neither passion nor regret could easily escape. Dowries, too, brought their own share of litigation. The dowry was not a gift, as it might appear today, but a legal structure, an amount of land, goods, or coin given by the bride's family to ensure her support should she be widowed, and often used as a bargaining chip in the initial marriage negotiations. When a marriage dissolved through death or divorce, or when a family claimed the dowry had not been paid in full, disputes erupted. Husbands might sue their in-laws, or vice versa, over missing sums. Women might be left in limbo, unable to remarry or claim inheritance until the dowry was settled. In many cases, entire generations of extended family were drawn into lawsuits that outlived the love, or the lovers, that had sparked them. One notable example comes from Siena in the 13th century, where a widow sued her deceased husband's family for the return of her dowry. She claimed she had brought a chest filled with silver cups and fine linens into the marriage, goods her husband had quietly sold off during their years together. After his death, his brothers refused to repay her. The court, poring over merchant receipts and witness statements, eventually ruled in her favor, but only after years of deliberation. By the time the silver was returned, its weight had long been measured in bitterness rather than coin. More scandalous still were the cases of seduction and sexual misconduct, particularly when one party claimed deception. In some jurisdictions, women could sue men for breach of promise if they had been seduced under the pretense of future marriage. These suits were not uncommon, and while the court's sympathy often depended on the woman's status and reputation, some did find restitution. A man might be ordered to pay a fine, perform public penance, or in rare cases, marry the woman he had dishonored. That such forced marriages were often unhappy mattered little to the courts, whose primary concern was not love but restoration of order and protection of lineage. In Northern Europe, especially within merchant towns like Bruges or Cologne, love and litigation could also intertwine in commercial contracts. Betrothals were sometimes formalized in written documents, signed by witnesses and sealed with wax. These pre-marriage agreements laid out not only the expected dowry and inheritance rights, but also behavior clauses, such as chastity until marriage or promises to remain within a city's bounds. Breaking these agreements could result in lawsuits, not always from the jilted lover, but from their family, or even from guilds invested in maintaining civic harmony. Interestingly, even the church, so often the stern arbiter of morality, sometimes acted as a mediator rather than an enforcer. In cases where young lovers had defied parental arrangements and married in secret, the church might offer conditional absolution if the marriage could be proven to have been consensual and legitimate. But when deception was involved, especially if a woman had been led astray by false promises, the church courts did not hesitate to impose penance fasts, pilgrimages, or public confession. And then there were the rare but revealing cases where love itself became the crime. Inquisitorial records contain chilling transcripts of trials where individuals were accused of using magic or potions to seduce others, particularly when those others were of higher social rank. A love spell, if discovered, could land one in prison or worse. The court might demand confessions, extract testimonies under torture, and examined tokens or charms found in the accused's possession. The boundary between courtship and witchcraft was, in some regions, dangerously thin. What all these cases reveal is a paradox. While love in medieval times was surrounded by rituals of restraint and social control, it was also deeply embedded in the legal machinery of the day. Every whispered promise, every exchanged ring, every betrayal carried legal implications. Love was not, as modern sensibilities might imagine, a matter only of the heart. It was a matter for lawyers, scribes, and judges. It was recorded, notarized, and preserved in the brittle parchment of dusty archives, where it waits still, faded, fragile, but unmistakably human. Here, in the margins of medieval law books, love wears a different face. It is not always noble or poetic. It is sometimes calculating, desperate, angry, or resigned. But in its conflicts between desire and duty, between promise and betrayal, it remains deeply recognizable. For even when sealed with wax and litigated in full view, the laws of the flesh were never quite able to master the spirit behind them. In the hushed stillness of medieval villages, where the tolling of church bells marked not only time but rhythm, morality, and fate, the choices for a life partner were never entirely free from complication. There were no bustling cities teeming with anonymous faces, no carriages filled with hopeful strangers arriving from distant lands, and certainly no opportunity to swipe left or right through the known world. Instead, the medieval villager lived surrounded by those they had always known, cousins, kin, neighbors whose bloodlines and family ties overlapped in a complex unseen web. And while love, or something like it, may have quietly bloomed beneath the thatched rooftops and along the winding hedgerows, the shadow of consanguinity loomed with unsettling regularity. In a world where nearly everyone was somehow related, falling in love could easily become a sin. The Church, ever the guardian of both souls and social order, took a rigorous interest in who could marry whom. Canon law was meticulous in its concern over incestuous unions, not merely the kind that defy biological taboos, but those that transgressed the Church's broad definitions of spiritual and blood kinship. In early medieval centuries, the prohibited degrees of relationship extended as far as the 7th degree of consanguinity, meaning that even distant cousins were in theory forbidden from marrying. This prohibition did not only apply to those linked by blood, but also to those tied by marriage or spiritual bonds such as godparenthood. The reasoning was partly theological and partly social. A marriage that united two closely tied families could, in theory, blur lines of inheritance, create undue concentrations of wealth or land, or disrupt the fragile lattice of local alliances. But in the quiet, insular world of a medieval hamlet, the realities of kinship were unavoidable. When a community comprised perhaps a few dozen households and people rarely traveled more than a few miles from their place of birth, the chance of meeting someone truly unrelated was slim. The village church might baptize generations of the same interwoven families, the priest himself often aware of which farm girl was second cousin to which shepherd's son. The villagers too knew their roots. Oral history was their heritage, their memory long, and gossip even longer. And yet, despite all this awareness, love, or at least marriage, continued to cross the delicate lines that canon law had so carefully drawn. This conflict gave rise to one of the more peculiar aspects of medieval romance, the seeking of dispensations. Couples who wished to marry, despite falling within the prohibited degrees of kinship, had to obtain formal permission from the Church. These dispensations, often granted by bishops or even the Pope himself, were not granted lightly. They required documentation, explanation, and more often than not, payment. This transformed love into a legal and financial ordeal, with hopeful couples forced to wait as clerical authorities debated whether their union would imperil the community's moral fabric or merely inconvenience ecclesiastical bookkeeping. In some places, these dispensations became so commonplace that they effectively nullified the strictness of the laws they sought to bypass. In parts of rural France, for instance, records from the 14th century show repeated instances of villagers petitioning to marry their cousins, second, third, even first, under the pretense of maintaining landholdings or family alliances. These were not grand, strategic dynastic unions, but small, local affairs. A field here, a herd of sheep there, a dowry of pewter bowls and worn linens. Still, the church insisted on formality, and many couples, poor and anxious, endured long separations and legal delays to satisfy the requirements. It is important to understand that these laws did not only affect romantic choice, they shaped the entire architecture of medieval society. For noble families, especially those in the higher rungs of aristocracy, the issue was even more pronounced. The elite class was, by design, small and intermarried. The most powerful dynasties often found themselves caught in the bind of needing to consolidate power through marriage, while simultaneously avoiding the ever-tightening net of consanguinity. The famous union of Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Henry II of England, for example, was technically within the prohibited degrees, yet was permitted through papal dispensation. These marriages, though necessary for politics, carried the same spiritual risks, and the church never let them forget it. And while the highborn could rely on their scribes and clerks to draft the necessary petitions, the peasants and townsfolk were left to navigate this labyrinth with little guidance. Some tried to obscure their ties, hoping no one would notice that their great-grandmothers were sisters, or that their fathers had once been foster brothers. Others leaned on the local priest, who might conveniently forget a degree or two of separation in the name of pastoral kindness. Still others gave up entirely, content to cohabitate without formal blessing, forming unions of practical necessity rather than legal standing. These unblessed unions, though unofficial, were often tolerated by communities who knew too well the futility of seeking partners beyond their shallow gene pools. In rare and more tragic cases, couples who married in ignorance of their kinship were torn apart upon discovery. The church held the power to annul such unions, even those that had borne children. The children declared illegitimate would be marked in inheritance disputes and ecclesiastical records. Families could be fractured by the cold judgment of canon law, their attempts at love reduced to clerical error. There are recorded instances of couples separated after decades of marriage, once a zealous bishop or papal investigator uncovered evidence of a forbidden tie. No passion, no longevity, and no shared hardship was considered strong enough to overrule the ancient prohibitions. But beneath all this doctrine, there lingered a quiet irony. In obsessively cataloguing bloodlines and forbidding certain unions, the church had unintentionally elevated the very awareness of kinship to an almost superstitious level. Where once marriage might have been a matter of survival or alliance, it became instead a ritual of both passion and paranoia. The act of loving another was no longer just a social or emotional endeavor. It was a spiritual and legal puzzle, where one had to weigh attraction against ancestry, desire against dogma. And yet, somehow life went on. The fields were ploughed, the bread was baked, the children were born, often into families whose bonds were tighter than permitted but stronger than forbidden love could be. The rules were strict, yes, but humanity remained stubbornly flexible. In some cases, love bent the law. In others, the law bent love until it broke. But always, it hovered, watchful, heavy and oddly impersonal, over the hopes of every would-be couple who dared to love within the shadow of their own family tree. In the slow-turning world of the Middle Ages, where clouds drifted like prayers above cathedral towers and illness was as common as hunger, medicine was not a field of certainty, but of symbols, sensations, and the unseen. The body, in medieval understanding, was not an isolated machine of muscle and bone. It was a vessel ruled by balances and flows, a harmony of invisible forces that echoed the music of the cosmos. When it came to love, attraction and mating, these same beliefs guided decisions, diagnoses, and desperate hopes. Courtship was not just a social contract or a theological venture. It was a matter of fluids and humours, of hot and cold, of wet and dry. Medieval lovers, whether peasants or nobles, looked not only to the eyes or the heart, but to the urine flask and the astrologer's chart, hoping to divine their fate through the science of the soul and body. At the root of medieval medical thought lay the theory of the four humours, a system inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, and passed down through centuries of monastic study and translation. According to this doctrine, the human body was governed by four principal fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was associated with one of the four elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and each had its own temperament: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, or melancholic. Health, both physical and emotional, depended on the proper balance of these humours. An excess or deficiency could lead to illness, instability, or unruly behaviour, and crucially, it was believed to affect love. A person with a sanguine disposition, warm, moist, and full of blood, was said to be passionate, optimistic, and physically attractive. Such individuals were often seen as ideal lovers, prone to romance and indulgence. Choleric types, hot and dry, were more prone to anger and ambition, perhaps too intense for harmonious marriage. The phlegmatic, cool, and moist, were slow to rouse but dependable, while the melancholic, cold and dry, were withdrawn and prone to sorrow. In a courtship or matchmaking scenario, families and physicians alike might consider these temperaments when advising on marital compatibility. Were both partners too melancholic? Would a choleric husband clash with a sanguine wife? These were not idle musings but serious concerns, as real to the medieval mind as genetics or personality are to us today. The alignment of the humours extended beyond personality into fertility itself. Medieval medicine held that successful reproduction required not only the proper emotional disposition, but also the balanced mixing of male and female humours. Fertility problems, a source of shame and suspicion, were often explained through this lens. A woman with too much cold and moisture might be considered barren, her womb sluggish and unresponsive. A man lacking the proper heat or vital spirit might be thought impotent, his seed too weak or watery. Remedies ranged from herbal tonics and baths to dietary changes meant to restore humour balance. Couples desperate for children might consume warming foods, such as spices or wine, or be bled to reduce melancholic excess. And yet, even this was not the limit of medieval ideas about the body and love. The female body, in particular, was a mystery cloaked in myth and mistrust. Medieval physicians often relied on ancient texts rather than observation, and their beliefs about female anatomy were riddled with errors and superstitions. It was commonly thought, for example, that women emitted their own form of seed during intercourse, and that successful conception required both male and female ejaculation. If a woman did not reach climax, it was believed pregnancy might not occur. This theory was not born of compassion or progressive thinking. It served instead to explain infertility, while reinforcing male authority over pleasure. Other beliefs were more grotesque. Some medical texts suggested that a woman's womb could wander inside her body, causing hysteria if not anchored by pregnancy or intercourse. The cure? Marriage, naturally. Virginity, though prized by the church for spiritual reasons, was seen by some physicians as a potential danger to health. The idea that sexual activity preserved a woman's emotional and physical stability found its way into both folk wisdom and medical counsel, creating yet another layer of pressure on women to marry, mate, and reproduce. Astrology, too, played its part in the strange dance between medicine and love. The position of the stars and planets at the time of birth, or at the moment of a proposed union, was thought to influence both compatibility and fertility. Physicians with training in astrology might consult charts before approving a marriage or recommending treatment. A couple born under incompatible signs might be warned against union. Venus, Mars, and the Moon all carried their symbolic weight. Fertility, desire, mood, and harmony were believed to rise and fall with their celestial movements. To many, the stars offered the final word, their cold glow affirming or denying earthly longing. Perhaps most curious to modern ears are the many fertility charms, potions, and rituals that blurred the line between medicine, magic, and religion. A woman hoping to conceive might carry a dried rabbit's foot or drink a mixture made from boiled herbs and powdered animal bones. Some bathed in wine steeped with certain flowers, others prayed at the shrines of saints known for their intercessory powers. Saint Margaret for childbirth, Saint Anne for conception, and so forth. These rituals were often accompanied by folk beliefs that defied logic but persisted through centuries. Eating the heart of a dove was said to arouse passion. Touching a pregnant woman's belly could transfer fertility. Sleeping beneath the full moon might inspire dreams of one's future spouse, but just as often, failure in love or reproduction was met not with sympathy but with blame. If a woman did not conceive, she might be accused of harboring sin or bitterness. If a man showed signs of impotence, whispers of witchcraft or divine punishment might follow. The absence of children, love or desire could turn quickly from a personal sorrow to a public scandal. Healing was rarely just about the body. It was a negotiation with God, society and fate. And so medieval lovers moved through a world where science and superstition were hopelessly intertwined, where bloodletting and planetary alignment might hold more weight than affection or understanding. The pursuit of love, marriage and fertility was not merely a journey of the heart but of the body, examined, diagnosed and often misunderstood. There was no division between romance and biology, no refuge from scrutiny. The very fluids within one's body were suspect. The night sky might hold secrets about one's soul, and beneath it all, in the darkened corners of smoky cottages or cloistered abbey libraries, the learned men of medicine wrote their scrolls and prescriptions, never truly knowing what moved the heart or the womb, but forever eager to explain it. In a world where freedom was rationed by gender, class and birth, where the paths of life were drawn not with choice but with obligation, there existed one quiet exception, a crack in the iron lattice of medieval control: the widow. She, unlike the maiden, had already passed through the furnace of marriage. She had been claimed, wedded, often young and voiceless, bound to a man not of her choosing, and yoked to his fortunes, his moods and his fate. But when death came, whether slow and wheezing or swift with sword or fever, and took her husband away, it left her not only in grief but, curiously, in a place of possibility. For the first time in her life, however narrow or fleeting, a woman might find herself in command of her future. Widowhood in the medieval world was both a curse and a key. On the surface, it was a sorrowful station. Widows were expected to mourn, to retreat into subdued clothing and modest behavior, to remember their departed husbands with decorum and restraint. Black veils and long silences marked their days, and if they wept too long they were pitied. If they recovered too soon they were scorned. The church encouraged chastity among widows, praising those who refused to remarry and instead devoted themselves to prayer, piety, and good works. In many sermons and treatises, the ideal widow was the one who remained alone, faithful in spirit even after death had closed the marriage bond. But the reality, as always, was more complex. While society idealized widowhood as a state of spiritual purity, it also understood, albeit quietly, the practical and economic truths that came with it. Widows, especially those of childbearing age, represented opportunities, and sometimes to themselves, rare moments of power. Unlike virgins, who were handed from father to husband like property, exchanged between guardians, widows in many regions were legally permitted to make their own choices regarding remarriage. They could negotiate terms, they could delay, they could decline, and in some cases, they could even propose. This relative autonomy varied by location and status. Among the peasantry, where laws were looser and customs more malleable, a widow might choose to remarry for love, for survival, or not at all. If she had sons old enough to work the land, she might remain alone and retain control of the household. If her husband had died without debt, she might inherit his tools, animals, or tenancy rights. In some manorial systems, widows were protected by customs that ensured they could remain in the home for a year and a day after their husband's death, a time known as widow's year, to mourn and decide their next steps. Among the wealthier classes, where marriages were as much about property as partnership, widowhood came with larger stakes. A noble widow might find herself the custodian of lands, dowries, and alliances. If she had borne sons, she could act as guardian until they came of age, effectively running estates and making administrative decisions. And while some lords and kings might pressure widows to remarry in order to strengthen political bonds, it was not uncommon for such women to resist, and to be allowed to do so. Queens and countesses might even wield influence in court as dowagers, shaping events from behind the veil of widowhood. But even in smaller, less grand households, widows held a unique place in the social fabric. They were living reminders of love, lost and labour continued. They ran inns, kept shops, brewed ale, and managed workshops, often more freely than married women, who remained under the legal control of their husbands. In towns across Europe, records show widows applying for and receiving trade licenses, joining guilds, or continuing the businesses their husbands had begun. They hired apprentices, argued in court, and paid taxes, all in their own names. This legal and financial agency brought with it a subtle but real transformation in how widows were perceived and how they perceived themselves. Some remarried quickly, often for protection or support, but others delayed, waited, or refused altogether. A second marriage could be one of convenience, affection, or strategic alliance. Crucially, it was more likely than a first marriage to be chosen freely. A widow might seek a gentler partner, one closer in age, or someone who respected her independence. And because she had already fulfilled the social expectation of marrying once, there was less scrutiny in how she conducted her second courtship. While maidens were guarded and gossiped about, widows often moved with quieter latitude, their actions viewed through a softened lens. Of course, not all widows enjoyed this freedom. Much depended on local custom, the nature of her husband's will, the presence of male relatives, and the opinions of the community. Some were pressured to remarry against their wishes, especially if their lands or wealth were desirable. Others found themselves quickly replaced, their children handed off to new stepfathers, and poor widows, without land or skills, often fell into poverty, forced to beg or labor for others. In cities, some entered the margins of society, their widow's veil a thin disguise for prostitution or petty crime. The line between freedom and vulnerability was narrow and easy to cross. Yet even within these difficulties, there remain stories of quiet defiance and unexpected joy. In court records and ballads, one occasionally finds tales of widows who pursued love, or at least companionship, on their own terms. A brewer's widow might marry her longtime assistant, a noblewoman might wed her steward, a country widow might refuse all suitors and live alone, raising her children and managing her fields. These were not grand romances or fairy tales, but quiet victories, assertions of choice in a world where so much was chosen for you. In many ways, the figure of the widow stood at a crossroads of the medieval imagination. She was a subject of pity, a figure of piety, a symbol of danger, and an object of desire. She could be wise or wily, gentle or grasping. Her sexuality was often viewed with suspicion. Liberated from her husband's control, she might become a temptress or a witch in the minds of fearful neighbors. But just as often, she was respected for her resilience, her prudence, her hard-earned authority. And so, as the candles burned low in stone chapels and hearth fires dimmed in village homes, the widow sat with a kind of hard-won dignity. Her freedom was not loud or sweeping, but it was real. In a time when dating was dictated by fathers, priests, and feudal needs, she stood briefly beyond their reach, a woman, alone, and sometimes, remarkably, at peace with that. In the hush of thatched cottages, and under the low eaves of candle-lit kitchens, there once passed whispers, whispered words about herbs that stirred the heart, powders that made a man stay, or drops slipped silently into wine that might make someone fall, foolishly and helplessly, in love. These murmurs often followed women, particularly the old, the solitary, the midwives, the herbalists, and the widows, women who knew too much, spoke too little, or worse, were thought to know what should not be known. In a world that revered female chastity and obedience, there was something unsettling, even dangerous, about women who seemed to hold sway over matters of affection and desire. And so, slowly and quietly, suspicion brewed into fear, and fear fermented into accusation. She was not just a healer, she was a witch. The medieval mind had little room for nuance when it came to love. Love, if noble, was to be pined for in poems and prayed about at night. Physical desire, however, was dangerous, a temptation from the devil, a weakness of the flesh, especially damning when it resided in women. A woman who expressed desire, or worse, who sought to control it, was often seen as unnatural, and in that twisted logic of fear, the unnatural was not simply immoral, it was magical. demonic, worthy of punishment. Love potions, charms and philtres were not uncommon in medieval Europe. They were sold in secret, passed between servants, and concocted by wise women who gathered herbs at dusk and ground them into dusty bowls by lamplight. Recipes were whispered down generations, mixtures of thyme, honey, mandrake root, or powdered bone, depending on the region and the rumour. Some were harmless tonics, meant more to calm the nerves than enchant the senses. Others were dangerously real, containing hallucinogenic plants or aphrodisiacal compounds that could cause disorientation, illness, or in rare cases, death. But most of these potions were not about harm. They were about hope. A lonely girl might buy a charm to win the eye of a distracted suitor. A wife, neglected or fearful, might slip a drop of something sweet into her husband's drink to rekindle a touch of warmth. A labourer's daughter might wear a ribbon that had been blessed by an old woman in the village, hoping it would protect her from seduction or worse. These acts were born not of malice, but of powerlessness, small, desperate gestures in a world where women had few tools with which to shape their romantic fates. But the Church did not approve of this kind of power, however modest. Clerical authorities preached often against amatory magic, condemning love potions and enchantments as tools of the devil. To them these were not innocent remedies but sinister manipulations, a distortion of God's natural order, and worse still, they were associated with the body, with lust, and with the terrifying notion that a woman might exert will over her own passions or over someone else's. Thus, a woman who made love potions or was rumoured to, occupied a dangerous liminal space too worldly for piety, too knowledgeable for safety, too independent for acceptance. Court records from across Europe reveal scattered stories, small haunting snapshots of lives unspooling under suspicion. In France, a midwife was accused of bewitching a man into marriage. In England, a woman was whipped after her neighbour claimed she had buried a heart-shaped bundle beneath the moon to make her lover return. In Germany, a widow was drowned when townspeople found herbs hidden in the folds of her apron, believing they were ingredients for a demonic charm. These were not grand trials of dark sorcery. They were village suspicions, quiet punishments, whispered judgments, all bound up in the fear of women who wanted too much, or dared to want at all. Behind these accusations lurked deeper tensions, women who did not fit the mold, who were not young, submissive, or beautiful, were especially vulnerable. Old women, especially those who lived alone or survived on odd jobs, were frequently blamed when crops failed, livestock died, or men behaved strangely. And because love, like illness or weather, was unpredictable and painful, it was easy to find scapegoats when things went awry. If a betrothal failed, perhaps a witch had cursed it. If a man lost interest, perhaps someone had stolen his heart, literally. If desire bloomed in the wrong place, perhaps it had been planted by dark hands. But even among the elite, the fear of female influence lingered. Noble women who were thought to manipulate their husbands were accused of using charms or potions. Some queens were whispered to have enchanted kings, making them love too blindly or obey too readily. These stories were not just gossip, they were warnings. Female desire, even in whispers, had to be contained. A woman's place was to be wanted, not to want. To be loved, not to love first. This dynamic bled into the literature of the age. In ballads and tales, enchantresses abounded, beautiful, mysterious women who lured knights off their quests, who bewitched men with a glance or a sip of wine. These figures were not merely villains, they were personifications of anxiety. The seductive woman was a threat not just to virtue but to order itself. And yet she also represented something deeply alluring, the idea that love could be chosen, pursued and wielded, even by a woman. Of course, the vast majority of medieval women had no interest in spells or seduction. They wanted security, companionship, perhaps affection. But the very idea that some might want more, that they might act upon their longings, was enough to trigger deep unease. And in a society built on control, unease was a dangerous thing. So the old woman who knew which herbs eased the heart, or the young girl who tied knots in a ribbon to win affection, or the widow who whispered to a candle at night, these were not witches in the grand theatrical sense. They were women navigating a world that gave them little agency and punished them when they reached for more. But history in its heavy silence too often grouped them together under one shadowy word, witch. And so, through the narrow lanes and cold chapels of medieval Europe, there moved a quiet fear, not of spells, truly, but of women who knew too much, wanted too much, or dared to shape love with their own hands. In the end, it was not the potion that scared them, it was the woman holding it. In the medieval world, marriage was not simply a private vow whispered between two hearts. It was a public contract, a solemn, visible union with legal, spiritual, and social consequences. And while love might have danced quietly behind closed shutters or flickered in glances exchanged across a crowded marketplace, marriage was meant to be done openly, witnessed by the community, blessed by the church, and approved by one's family. And yet, despite the rigidity of these expectations, there existed another path, a shadowy, uncertain one, trodden by couples who dared to marry in secret. These were the clandestine marriages, hidden unions forged without banns, without parental approval, without priests or processions. And though they were born in hope or desperation, they often led to suspicion, scandal, or even the unraveling of the bond itself. Clandestine marriage did not necessarily mean sinful or illegal. In many parts of medieval Europe, canon law allowed for a valid marriage to be created by simple mutual consent, a spoken agreement between a man and woman, sometimes sealed with a promise, sometimes with a token or clasp of hands, and sometimes with nothing more than words. As long as both parties were of age and agreed freely, such a union could, at least theoretically, be recognized by the church. The problem, however, was not in the theory, but in the practice. These secret promises, made without witnesses or formal ceremony, were ripe for dispute. Did she truly agree? Was he coerced? Was there a witness? Had it happened at all? The church, caught between upholding its teachings and maintaining social order, wavered. On one hand, it defended the notion that consent, not parental approval, or a public blessing, made a marriage valid. On the other hand, it recognized how easily such private agreements could be abused. A man might claim he had wed a woman to escape charges of seduction. A woman might claim a promise had been made when none had. Parents might disown their children for marrying below their station. Communities might reject unions they deemed improper or scandalous. And so, while the church allowed such marriages, it came to frown upon them, urging that all unions be solemnized before priests and witnesses, preferably in a church, so that there might be no confusion, no doubt, and most importantly, no room for secrets. But secrets, of course, were precisely the point. For many couples, especially those of unequal status or conflicting faiths, clandestine marriage was the only escape from parental control. Young nobles, minor clerks, or peasant girls might find themselves drawn together by genuine affection or quiet longing, only to face fierce opposition from families who saw marriage as a transaction, not a choice. In such cases, elopement and secret vows offered a risky but tempting solution. A couple might flee to a neighboring town, find a sympathetic priest, or marry one another privately, and simply hope that the union would be accepted, or at the very least survive. Still, it would be wrong to suggest that love was their goal. More often, the objective was security, reputation, or alliance. A good match was one in which both families gained something, not necessarily affection, but stability. A young woman with no dowry might be matched with an older widower in need of a caretaker. A man with a poor reputation might find a bride through the careful assurances of a broker who smoothed over past indiscretions or emphasized future prospects. Matchmakers were, in this sense, not just facilitators but storytellers, curators of the possible, sellers of the plausible. They did not lie outright, but they shaped truths like clay, presenting potential spouses in their most favorable light, knowing full well that first impressions might make or unmake a union before it had the chance to form. Payment for such services varied. Sometimes it was coin, handed over quietly in a kitchen, or beside the churchyard. Sometimes it was a portion of the wedding feast, or a gift of cloth, or grain, and in many cases, it was not the families who paid, but the communities, a recognition that a well-matched couple brought stability, not just to themselves, but to the wider village. A child born into a solid marriage would be less likely to become a burden. A widow remarried would no longer strain parish resources. A landless man with a dowried wife would become a contributor, not a drifter. In this way, matchmaking served the public good, even when it operated through private dealings. Of course, not all saw matchmakers kindly. The church, especially in earlier centuries, sometimes regarded them with suspicion, fearing that their negotiations might sidestep ecclesiastical oversight. Some clergy preferred that all matches be arranged through family and confirmed in church, with banns read and approvals given by those in authority. The idea of private individuals brokering unions, especially for profit, smacked, in certain circles, of manipulation, or even impiety. In times of reform or moral anxiety, matchmakers were denounced, sometimes lumped in with midwives, herbalists, and other women who worked on the margins of official power. Accusations ranged from deceit to witchcraft, especially if a match failed or led to scandal. But in most places, especially where need outweighed orthodoxy, they continued their work quietly, occasionally praised, more often simply tolerated. In Jewish communities across medieval Europe, matchmakers played an even more formal role. The shadchan, or traditional matchmaker, was a respected figure, often consulted by families when a child reached marriageable age. These brokers navigated complex webs of lineage, scholarship, dowry expectations, and community standing. Their role was not only accepted, but celebrated, seen as a way of ensuring proper, religiously aligned unions. And while affection might still bloom within these matches, it was not the priority. Compatibility, in faith, values and future goals, was the guiding star. In these circles, the work of matchmaking was sometimes seen as a mitzvah, a sacred act of kindness and duty. Across cultures and creeds then, the role of the marriage broker was one of balance, between desire and duty, between personal hope and public expectation, between emotional longing and economic reality. They worked with human hearts, yes, but more often with ledgers, reputations, and the deeply worn patterns of tradition. For every couple brought together through a broker's hand, there were a dozen factors at play: age, land, children, dowries, debts, alliances, each carefully weighed before a match could proceed. And when the match was made, and the wedding blessed, the broker often vanished into the background. There were no lingering thanks, no toasts in their honor. Their success was measured in silence, in homes that held, in children born, in fields plowed and tended without scandal. They were the invisible weavers of stability, not of stories, and in a world where love was often an afterthought, their quiet, careful work shaped more lives than the grandest of romances ever could. In a world bound by duty, tradition and survival, love, that bright, untamed thread of human longing, had always existed, though rarely in the forms we now imagine. In the medieval marriage, it was not expected, nor was it necessary. One married, not for affection but for alliance, for land, for safety, for obedience to family and God. And yet, even within those tight constraints, the heart, that soft, stubborn organ, found room to breathe. Over time, and only in some rare cases, love did not precede marriage, but followed it, slowly, quietly, like moss growing on ancient stone. There were no candle-lit courtships in the fields, no whispered confessions by moonlight that led to sanctioned union, but there were shared labors. There were years spent planting the same rows, mending the same fences, nursing the same children through illness and cold. There were small, wordless acts of care, a worn cloak folded at night, a bucket carried when backs were sore, a gesture of patience in a world that allowed little. And in this slow accumulation of ordinary days, affection sometimes grew, tentative, unnoticed at first, but real in its weight. Not the love of sonnets or stories, but of long glances across a table, of loyalty tested in storms and hunger. Among wealthier households, where political matches were the norm, love was even less expected. Wives and husbands moved in parallel, sometimes cordial, often distant, but here too, now and then, time softened what was arranged. A shared grief over a lost child, a common fondness for music, an understanding forged in the quiet rooms beyond the reach of servants. These things made space for something like love, though often unnamed, for medieval people lacked not only the vocabulary for romantic affection within marriage, but also the expectation to care for a spouse, genuinely, beyond obligation, was seen not as a right but a surprise, and yet by the later Middle Ages, whispers of change had begun. The notion of courtly love, born in the songs of troubadours and the verses of poets, introduced the idea that love, deep, aching, personal, was worthy of celebration, even if it remained mostly outside of marriage. These stories idealized longing, not union. They honored desire that defied arrangement, but in their telling, they sowed the seeds of something different, a reimagining of what the heart might want. Gradually, unevenly, this idea began to seep into more practical life, not immediately, not for peasants sowing barley or widows bartering eggs, but in the slow reshaping of cultural imagination. By the 16th and 17th centuries, this shift became more visible. In letters, diaries and church records, there are signs of couples choosing, not just accepting, their partners. Parents still ruled, dowries still loomed, reputations still mattered, but more frequently, young people resisted forced matches. They waited, they pleaded, they ran away, and sometimes, only sometimes, they were allowed to marry for affection. This did not mean love became central, only that it had begun to matter. It was a tremor, not a revolution, but tremors, given time, can alter landscapes. Still, for the vast majority of people in the medieval world, love remained a luxury, not a requirement. They hoped, perhaps, that it might come, like spring after a harsh winter, but they did not expect it. To survive was enough. To raise children, pay taxes, and die with a name unsullied by scandal. These were the real goals. Love, if it came not as thunder but as a candle, small, flickering, easily extinguished by wind or time. And yet, in the letters of an aging husband who speaks fondly of his wife's bread, in the worn shoes of a wife who walks miles to bring her husband lunch in the fields, in the graves where couples rest side by side, not out of duty, but because at last, they chose each other, in these we find quiet evidence that love, however late, could blossom. It was not loud, it did not change the world, but it changed their world. As centuries passed, and the modern concept of dating, of choosing, of trying, of courting with emotion rather than arrangement, began to take hold, the slow crawl of affection into marriage became a walk, and eventually, for some, a run. But that was the work of later generations, of Enlightenment thinkers, of Industrial Revolution novels, and newspapers, and new ideas of the individual. In the Middle Ages, love walked carefully, unseen, yet it was there. And so we close this long and quiet journey, not with a grand conclusion, but with a soft truth. The medieval world, so often harsh and unyielding, did not forbid love, but merely forgot to prioritize it. In its place, it left structure, function, survival, yet people, being people, found ways. They touched hands beneath market stalls, they laughed while repairing roofs, they learned sometimes over decades to care for the stranger they married. For in the end, even in times ruled by hunger, by war, by plague, and by custom, the human heart beat on, slowly, stubbornly, and always, always in search of warmth.